The new school year is coming up fast, and the state has released reopening guidelines. Will our kids be safe? Weighing in this morning is State Senator Beverly Powell. Also, COVID-19 cases surge in Texas. Blacks and Hispanics are being disproportionately affected. Former state representative Helen Giddings says Texas has an obligation to do more. Turnout for early voting is heavier than expected for next week's runoff election for the race for U.S. Senate. Will there be any surprises? And the Democratic mayor of Houston cancels the Republican state convention. The result? A political hot potato in Texas. We'll talk with Travis County Republican Party Chair Matt Mackowiak.
Inside Texas Politics with Jason Whiteley starts now.
Hey, good morning. I'm David Schechter in for Jason. Before we sit down with our first guest, let's begin with the top political headlines. The new jobless numbers are out. Another 1.3 million Americans filed new unemployment claims last week. In Texas, 117,000 were first-time filers. Overall, nearly 2.8 million Texans have filed since mid-March. Almost 50 million Americans have filed in the last 16 weeks. With new coronavirus and related hospitalizations surging at alarming rates, Governor Greg Abbott has expanded his ban on elective medical surgery. Procedures not medically necessary are now barred in more than 100 counties. Abbott had already put that hold on the biggest cities and several South Texas counties. Procedures can still take place mostly in rural areas. Coronavirus concerns are not keeping voters from the polls. Texans are voting at an historic pace in the July 14th runoff, according to the Secretary of State. Through July 8th, nearly 800,000 Texans have voted. More than 482,000 have been Democrats and 316,000 Republicans. Democratic turnout is higher because of the state runoff between M.J. Hager and Royce West. Houston Mayor Sylvester Turner, a Democrat, sparked a political firestorm this week when he pulled the plug on the Texas Republican Party convention. The convention was scheduled to take place this upcoming week in Houston, but the city has been hit hard by the coronavirus pandemic, and the mayor said for the health and safety reasons, he didn't want the GOP to go on. Travis County Republican Chair Matt Mackowiak is our first guest, and thank you for being with us this morning. I appreciate it. I assume you guys think the mayor made the wrong call. There's been lawsuits and things like that. So what was wrong with what the mayor did?
Yeah, look, I'll start by saying that there was no perfect option here. There are risks to doing an event like this. You have people coming in from all over the state of Texas, perhaps bringing coronavirus with them if they're asymptomatic. But then more importantly, by congregating together, even if you do it as safely as possible, you could contract the virus and then take it back to wherever you live.
Sure.
And that is not just community spread, that's on a statewide basis. That said, I know the Republican Party of Texas went beyond even what the city is requiring as it relates to coronavirus public health guidelines. They canceled all kinds of events that would normally happen at a state convention. They were going to have hand sanitizer on site. They were doing temperature checks. And they were strongly encouraging masks. And in fact, we're going to be handing out masks for free. I think the timing of this is the biggest thing I'd have a problem with.
How so? What's up with the timing on that?
Yeah, the mayor waited till 5 days before it started. He made up his mind weeks ago that he didn't want this event to happen. He just didn't have the full sole authority to cancel it. Formally, it had to be canceled by Houston First, a nonprofit that runs the George R. Bryant Convention Center. He basically told them they had to cancel it. And so they exercised the force majeure provision in the contract, which I think specifically references a pandemic to ultimately cancel the event. And now it's tied up in lawsuits.
Sure. But are you saying that it was just poor management of the overall situation, or that there was politics involved since he's a Democrat and this is a Republican convention?
Yeah, look, I don't want to doubt his intentions. I hope there wasn't politics involved. The mayor's office is a nonpartisan office, but he certainly has been a Democrat in his career, certainly in the state legislature. To me, it's more a question of timing, and this is what the Republican Party of Texas lawsuit references. Is just a few weeks ago, you had massive protests in Houston around the senseless killing that we saw in Minnesota, and that was tens of thousands of people in public congregating together, some wearing masks, some not, most not maintaining social distance. And so for the mayor to make a distinction between a protest, which is a large gathering happening outdoors, versus an indoor large gathering, making sure one's okay but the other's not, I think that does raise the question of whether politics is part of this.
So that you kind of get to the tough call aspect of being a leader at this point. Let's move to the governor, who's made essentially all the calls up to now. and we are in a crisis with health. Did he reopen too soon? Does he deserve blame for what we're seeing now?
Well, I think the cause of why we are where we are now is complicated. It's a mix of factors. Testing increasing is part of it. Yes, the reopening is part of it. We've also tested all of our nursing homes and more than half of our prison population. That's part of it. Young people congregating together and going to bars, that's part of it. And I do think the protests that occurred 3 or 4 weeks ago, which take 14 days to start showing up, is part of it as well. Look, the governor said at the very beginning he knew that there would be more cases if we reopen, but we wanted to try to save the economy. And he's the only person who has statewide responsibility, who has to balance the public health needs with the economy. And so the question I would have for Democrats is if you want to go back to a shutdown, what are the costs of going back to a shutdown? How many jobs are you willing to lose? What are the public health consequences in terms of suicides and psychological problems?
Sure, but that's a forward-looking question, but looking back on it, the decision to open appears to have been too early in terms of at least the public health numbers, does it not?
So we started phase 1 on May 1st, and we saw almost no significant increase throughout the entire month of May, right? And so that's why I don't know that you can directly connect it to the reopening. Again, I think the reopening is one of 4 or 5 factors, like I said a minute ago. So look, he faced a tough choice. He's paused the reopening. He may take additional steps. If we don't have this turnaround the next week, he may go to some type of partial shutdown, or even let cities or counties exercise some discretion there. He is getting hit from all sides. There's no question. He's in a no-win position politically. Again, he's trying to balance public health with the economy, and that's sometimes that makes you forces you to make a difficult choice.
Definitely, I mean, about the toughest spot you could be in. What about the legislature? The governor has made all the calls. The legislature seemingly pretty silent. Would a special session be called for here, that the legislature can get involved and be a part of some of these decisions? What's their responsibility?
I think it's really unlikely that a special session will be called. I know there are some legislators, in fact, some on the left and on the right, who've asked for one. On the right, it's mostly because they think Abbott's gone too far. On the left, it's because they want to, I guess, see him go further. I think a special session is unlikely. The governor hates special sessions, doesn't think it's necessary. This is an executive branch function in terms of the statewide responsibility. Legislators have one district that they're responsible to. Cut you off here.
I know I've gone a little bit over my time, but I appreciate you being with us, and thanks for answering the questions, and we look forward to hearing from you again soon.
Thanks.
A day after Texas surpassed 10,000 new confirmed cases in a single day, as we mentioned, Houston canceled the Texas Republican Party's convention. The Texas Medical Association had already pulled its support, and elected officials, including Governor Greg Abbott and Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, had planned to give their speeches virtually anyway. Let's bring in Ross Ramsey now. He's the co-founder and executive editor of the Texas Tribune. Good to see you. How are you doing?
Fine. Good morning.
So my question is, what's more valuable to the Republicans, holding that convention face-to-face or being able to say that a Democrat killed their convention?
I think they're better off in the latter. You know, a Democratic mayor gets to say, I killed this, his fans like that. The Republican delegates don't have to go to a city that's a hot spot right now. And the leaders of the Republican Party end up saying, well, you know, we wanted to do it, but the Democrats wouldn't let us. It's kind of a win for everybody.
So it sounds like statewide that Texans are starting to feel like in polling information that they're maybe seeing that this pandemic is going to go on for a long time and hunkering down. Even though, the state fair was just canceled this week. The governor is just totally running the show, politically speaking. Who are the winners and losers if he's just handling all these decisions?
Well, if it comes out all right, he's the big winner. If it doesn't, he's the big loser. He's sort of put all the stakes on his table and has taken power away from county judges and mayors and others along the way. So it's kind of on his desk at this point.
Okay, thanks, Ross. We'll see you in a little bit later in the show. Coming up next, can we keep our kids safe as we reopen schools? That's the big question. State Senator Beverly Powell weighs in on school reopening. Former State Representative Helen Giddings also on our show, the disproportionate impacts that COVID-19 is having on blacks and Hispanics. Texas schools start reopening in a few weeks, and the Texas Education Agency issued guidelines on how to safely bring kids back to school. Still, many people question whether state and local school districts will be ready. Texas State Senator Beverly Powell thinks it's too soon. Senator Powell is a Democratic member of the Texas Senate Education Committee and former Burleson ISD School Board president. She represents many of the Tarrant County communities, including parts of Fort Worth. Thanks for being with us. Nice to see you this morning.
David, thank you for having me.
So we had these guidelines that came out from the TEA this week, but then almost immediately heard that Dallas ISD is looking to push back their start date because they weren't quite ready. Are we ready? Are these guidelines helpful, and are we ready to do this?
Well, I think it's important first to note that the 9 pages of guidelines that the TEA released this week are just the first step in the guidance for how we get back into school in the state of Texas. I do believe that it's irresponsible to consider opening schools at a time when our COVID cases are on the rise, when our hospitals are concerned.
So if school started today, would you say, let's not open these buildings physically?
I would. I think it's too early to make that decision. I think we have a little bit of time. We have a window of opportunity here to consider delaying bringing our children back into the classroom. Since day one of this crisis, we've made it our priority to be concerned about the health and welfare of our children and their educators. And I think that we're at a crisis point when we're even reconsidering the possibility of stepping back in our reopening thought process. So certainly, I think it's a little too early.
Okay.
Start the conversation about putting children back in the classroom.
Let me follow up with this. A lot of these extra precautions cost more money. To do the single-serve food costs more money. To serve kids food at home costs more money. And to reconfigure schools costs more money. And internet connections cost more money. Where are school districts going to get this money? Will the state help them?
Certainly, I think the state is postured to help them. I think the federal government has provided additional resources to get our kids back into the classroom. But first and foremost, there is a real balance here with making sure that we protect the health and welfare of children first and teachers. So this is not an area that we can scrimp on. We have to be certain that our classrooms are sanitized, that we set up systems that allow our children to be protected in the best ways possible. And there is not a soul at TEA or in your legislature that don't put that very first in their thought process.
Let me ask you one more question about internet access. That was a huge issue. And in Dallas County, for example, or DISD, there are 36,000 families didn't have internet, similar in Fort Worth and other places. So a lot of school districts now are asking for this solution where the school building itself can serve as a way to serve internet out into the neighborhood. It's called point to multipoint. I'm sure you know about that. But it requires a lot of changes. Is that something you support? Should school districts now be providing internet to the neighborhoods?
You know, I absolutely just do support that. And we've been in conversation with providers across the state of Texas. We understand that there are 2 issues with regard to making sure that all children are connected to the internet. And that's one of availability and one of access.
Okay,
in our rural areas.
Yeah. I know that there's a lot there, and it's a rural urban issue for sure, but thank you for letting us know your support of that issue. People are obviously looking at internet connectivity as a big issue for the school year. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
According to a recent New York Times report, the impacts of the coronavirus fall more heavily on blacks and Hispanics. These groups are nearly twice as likely as whites to die from the virus and 3 times as likely to become infected. Even worse, the hospitalization rate for the virus for both black and Hispanic residents is more than 4 times the rate for white residents. Former state representative Helen Giddings says COVID-19 has put a spotlight on how minorities are underserved when it comes to health care and that Governor Abbott needs to do more. Thanks for joining us this morning. I really appreciate it. You're asking the governor to institute an Office of Minority Health. Why? What would it do?
COVID-19 has really put a spotlight on the disparities that minorities suffer in terms of health care. While the reports are changing, even as we speak, for the most part, we're hearing that African Americans and Latinos are being hospitalized and are dying at 3 times the rate of the rest of the population. And so we need to take a real look at what's going on. We know that for the most part, they work in service jobs. A lot of people work in essential positions where they don't have the opportunity to work remotely from home. We know that many times they're underinsured. We know that in a lot of cases, they have underlying conditions. So we really need to take a serious look at the information.
What would an Office of Minority Health, so you've laid out the disparities, what would the office do in order to change some of that?
First of all, we need to have the research and the information. We have to have the data if we are going to do things that make a difference. So we need to have the collection of that information. And of course, we did have an Office of Minority Health in Texas, and in 2017, it was defunded. And so I simply ask that we go back and refund the Office of Minority Health, that we have a task force to look at some of these issues.
You know, understandably so, there's been a great focus on the health and safety of the people in the state and making sure the hospitals have what they need. And then you have this idea of reopening and having some of the biggest and greatest minds in Texas be focused on the reopening of Texas and the economy. Have minorities been left out of the conversation in terms of the way minorities have been impacted and how they can recover?
I think largely minorities have been left out of that conversation. And as you just mentioned, we had a task force on mitigation. We had a task force to deal with reopening advice. And I think it just makes sense to have a task force to really look at this disproportionate impact. And while I believe that the state of Texas really ought to take the lead on that, we also believe that there are other places in our community where we can start to look at that issue. And one of the things that is pretty exciting to me is that UT Southwestern will start a groundbreaking study this summer that focuses on North Texas and what is happening in North Texas in terms of this virus.
Very good. Thank you very much. We appreciate your time this morning.
Thank you.
All right, early voting in Texas is leading to record turnout. Will there be any surprises on Tuesday? We'll start there next on the Reporters Roundtable.
This is Inside Texas Politics with Jason Whiteley.
Cool. It's time now for the Reporters Roundtable to put the headlines into perspective. Ross is back, of course, and joining us each week. Bud Kennedy from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. Hey, Bud. And Bernadine Steptoe, the political producer here at WFA. Thanks, everybody, for being with us, the Brain Trust. Let's talk about the runoff election a little bit. It feels like no one has been paying a lot of attention to the Hager-West race, but then, you know, Hager started off with this huge lead and West cut it way down. Is this race, Bernadine, is it exciting people? Are people engaged in it?
I don't know if they're necessarily engaged in this particular race, but they are engaged enough to go out and vote. Because in terms of runoff elections, we're seeing record numbers. So something is exciting them. I think that they're going out, and this is even in spite of the coronavirus. But I think they're excited because they want Democrats who are voting in larger numbers. I think they're showing what they're going to do. They have momentum they're going to do in November. They want their candidates in office.
Bud, what do you think?
And a lot of those votes are mail-in votes. Democrats are showing that they are mailing in ballots as many as they can in record numbers. To those who can mail in ballots are voting that way. This is the biggest Democratic runoff in 30 years in Texas. Yeah. Democrats are outvoting Republicans in Tarrant County 2-1. Hager and West both have run spirited campaigns. It's gotten more spirited toward the end. And really, they've shown that either one of them might be able to put a good race up against John Cornyn.
We've heard, Ross, we haven't had ads on television. This is sort of like happening right now. We haven't really had a lot of political ads in our life. So is that playing a role in getting people to be aware of this race and realize that it's happening?
I think so. I think, this is going to be a national election. It's really about Donald Trump and whether you like him or you don't like him. And right now, the Democrats are pretty vociferously against him. They're kind of having a moment. Everybody expected the worst about this. It's mid-July. It's a runoff. There's not a giant race on the thing, but people are showing up.
Do you think Cornyn has a favorite who he'd like to go off against in November?
I think that, most of what he's been saying has been kind of promotional about West. I think he'd prefer to run against West. I'm not sure exactly why, but That's what his press releases and his conversations look like.
Okay, but let's talk about the TEA school reopening guidelines. The legislature has been kind of absent while this has all been going on in terms of calling the shots of what's going to happen. The legislature, or the TEA, comes out with these recommendations, and then people kind of get a little bit sort of confused. Was there enough information there, Bud? Is this being managed well? Because school really is what everybody, that's the big thing. Like, how are we going to get school started? Is this being handled well politically?
You know, there's a long, detailed list, and nobody's looked at it, just like they didn't look at the long, detailed list of restaurant rules, and the bars didn't look at the long, detailed list of their rules. The state requirements are kind of cumbersome. People want to be able to trust their school district. It's all about locally, and do you trust your school district? Right now, nobody tells us which nursing homes have COVID. Nobody tells us which daycares have COVID. People have to trust that the schools will tell them when there's an infection and how they're cleaning it.
We got about a minute left. Bernadine, what do you think? Trust is the key here?
Trust is definitely the key. And I think that there's not enough information for parents to be comfortable. And you talk about in terms of politics, if the politicians don't get this right, everybody's going to be in trouble, particularly the Republicans who are in control.
So Ross, you think the governor should sort of step into what's happening with schools, or leave that to the TEA?
I think that he's in the middle of it. 65% of Texans in a recent University of Texas poll said that they aren't ready to send their kids back to school. If the disease doesn't turn, they've got some more decisions to make before the classes open.
Okay, guys, thank you very much for your time as always, and thank you for watching. We're going to be here every weekend. We'll be back here next Sunday on Inside Texas Politics. We want you to stay healthy and have a good week. See you next week.